Everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. Well, first, are there any questions from either the readings or other items? And then what about the earlier lectures from Rob Mutry and Ashley Hoffman? Did they say anything that was of particular interest or things that you had questions about or um, agreed, disagreed, or have didn't understand or had questions about? Anybody?
Yeah, Chris, I had a question. What is an informational committee hearing? I noticed on the hearing schedule it said it was an informational hearing, and I didn't understand exactly what
Yeah,
that was.
sure. So the vast majority of committee hearings are what we generally refer to as bill hearings, meaning, of course, that they are hearing and voting on bills. They can also have oversight hearings, which is almost investigative, although usually they refer to it as an oversight. That generally involves an executive branch department or agency, board or commission that they want to look into. Uh, I think during COVID, for example, there were several oversight or investigatory hearings regarding EDD, the Employment Development Department, and how they were handling applications for unemployment. When several million people, at least temporarily, lost their jobs in California due to the shutdown. And as a result, um, the system had a massive overload, for lack of a better description, with all of those folks, having to apply for unemployment insurance. And then informational, the last type. And on the investigative side, I draw a distinction between oversight and investigation hearing or investigatory committee, only because, and they're rarely held, to be fair. Um, a big one was when they investigated then insurance commissioner Chuck Quackenbush, I would say 20 plus years ago, because they do have the power of subpoena, for example. And so, there are those types of, um, things where they really get into the gory details, if you will. Um, again, usually it's for an executive branch agency or department or something. Then the last type, and your original question, of course, informational. So an informational hearing can occur here at the Capitol or around the state. It is about a topic as opposed to a bill, and they can't vote on or take any actions in an informational hearing. It's strictly to gather information, right? And so they're taking, testimony from, generally they have panels or at least witnesses lined up. Sometimes or more often, they'll start with sort of a neutral player, if you will, LAO most often, the Legislative Analyst Office, which of course is the independent advisor to the legislature. Um, so that's an informational hearing. Anybody else? What about on the lobbying profession? No? All right. Well, then I'll get into my sort of view. And then the next 2 weeks will be on budget. I'm still trying to confirm a good date and time. Uh, Next Friday, a week and a half from now, is the last day of the legislative session. So it's been hard to pin down the budget director, and they're still negotiating end of session budget stuff to have some additional trailer bills and some other stuff. So But we'll do that before, the 6 weeks are up. So it could be the last week, which may or may not make sense. As I mentioned in course one, um, when it came to the guest lectures, we basically let them pick what was convenient or not. Maybe it makes sense to have them perhaps at the conclusion of a section within the 6 week course. I don't know, but at least this first go around, we've been dependent upon, uh, the guest lecture scheduler, schedule and stuff. So, okay. Well, I think Ashley and Rob certainly did a very, good job, a thorough job, really talking about the role of, lobbyists and the reason why we have them and hopefully some of the benefits. I know, obviously, as they discussed, we have a little bit of a negative reputation, but anyways, I always jokingly say that no one goes to school to be a lobbyist. Many perhaps don't even know what they are. There aren't any real courses in it. No one gets a degree in it or anything else like that. Um, but I think it's fair to say that whether it's at the uh, lower level, at the local government level, or state, federal, there are even lobbyists at the EU. There are, I think it's about 730 uh, legislators in the European Union and about 12,000 or so registered lobbyists who are trying to influence the EU and its actions. And of course, we have them at the federal level, at the state, and then local jurisdictions, city and the county. I think we even have some folks who, work on planning commissions. We have some lobbyists who specialize in certain departments and agencies at the state level. The Public Utilities Commission, PUC, they regulate utilities. They also regulate some of the app-based drivers. The Energy Commission, the Transportation Commission, and some others. Different states define lobbying and lobbyists in different ways. I think California um, is mainly focused on legislative and regulatory. We have tried more than once to register so-called procurement lobbyists, or they generally refer to themselves as procurement consultants. And these are folks who represent many of the really thousands of companies out there that provide services and goods to government. For example, in the state of California, they acquire in excess of $11 billion annually in the purchase of goods and services, whether it's phone service, IT services, buying laptops, buying computers and photocopiers and telephones and all that stuff. The state of California, the federal government, or local governments all procure billions of dollars worth of services and goods each and every year. In California, the definition of lobbying is those who try to influence legislative or regulatory action. And legislative is pretty straightforward. Whether it's a bill that creates a statute, a constitutional amendment, which is placed on the ballot for a vote of the voters, ultimately, like we'll have November 4th in this special election. Or even resolutions. There are three different types of them, and those resolutions, they only are expressions of intent. They're statements. They don't make law in California. Even those are considered lobbying or legislative action. On the regulatory side, the Fair Political Practices Commission has basically opined that regulatory advocacy only involves the rulemaking, which we'll get into in course 3, the rulemaking process. This is how executive branch agencies, you'll recall from the first course, how they make laws, they adopt regulations. So that rulemaking activity or regulation making is lobbying according to the FPPC, but procurement work is not, because the regulatory agencies are engaged in, again, purchasing, acquiring goods and services, as opposed to engaging in some sort of lawmaking. So for good or for bad, whether you agree or disagree, uh, that's the view of the FPPC. So that again, rulemaking does not does qualify as lobbying, but procurement does not. Hold on, I'm just going to blow my nose. Hold on. Sorry about that. Um, so just note that at the California level. Um, Now, the other part of the requirement is that you're paid $2,000 or more in a calendar month to engage in influencing legislative or regulatory action. What does that mean? It means, for example, somebody who is a volunteer. Years ago, I worked on so-called IED, ignition interlock device legislation. This is where they place basically a breathalyzer in your vehicle, generally for people who have multiple DUI convictions, to allow them to drive, ensuring that, when you breathe into it, it demonstrates that you are, not drunk, right? And we did it in collaboration with parents and family members who are active in MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. All of those folks, even though they joined us in lobbying visits, writing letters, testifying in committee, etc., they were not registered as lobbyists. And there's only one reason. They did everything. They obviously attempted successfully to create what we ended up doing was a pilot project in several counties, but they were not paid. So because they weren't paid, they weren't required to register as lobbyists and disclose their activities. The other types of entities that are regulated at the state level include lobbying firms who are hired by lobbyist employers and who employ lobbyists. And then, of course, the big one is lobbyist employers. And those are public or private entities that hire lobbyists. Those lobbyists can work directly for an association or a business. They can also register for a public sector entity. Most of the 58 counties have lobbyists. Probably, I'm going to just guess, just over 100, 150 of the 482 cities in the state have lobbyists. I've represented for 19 years now the public transportation agency, LA Metro, in Los Angeles County, for example. Those are all lobbyist employers. Cisco, the oil companies, and the Labor Federation, and the wine grape growers, and the Chamber of Commerce, all of those types of entities, trade associations, unions, businesses are all lobbyist employers. All of these folks are required to disclose. That's the main thing. They have to disclose to the public, and they've had to since 1975 as a result of Prop 9. Prop 9 in 1974 enacted the Political Reform Act, otherwise known as the PRA, of 1974. It was actually championed by then Secretary of State Jerry Brown, who went on, of course, to be elected governor, and then he had an interlude, including mayor of Oakland for 2 terms and AG before returning to the governorship for 2 additional terms. He was able to serve 4 terms, by the way, because term limits, limiting them to 2 years in constitutional offices, was not in effect the first time he was in office. So no one, again, will be able to serve 4 terms as governor, only a maximum of 2. That's as an aside. So Brown was the one who championed Prop 9. The PRA also has limitations on lobbyists that are in the government code. Probably 2 of the most famous limitations are the so-called $10 rule or $10 gift rule. That means that a lobbyist cannot give a gift to any registered official. That's all elected legislators, agency secretaries and undersecretaries and department directors and chief deputies and all those folks, and most of the legislative staff, of no more than $10 in a calendar month. Lobbyist employers, by the way, the $10 gift rule applies to both a lobbyist and to his or her lobbying firm. Lobbyist employers, that one is actually subject to a CPI. It's about $590 per calendar year is their maximum. The $10 gift rule has been in effect since 1974. There was one legislative effort, I believe, in the late 90s when they tried to change it, but it got shot down. So that $10 gift rule has been in effect again since 1975. It took effect. Disclosure every quarter. Lobbyists, lobbying firms, and lobbyist employers have to disclose what they work on, for whom, and the amount of money that's paid. And you can check both ways, if you will. A lobbying firm discloses what it's paid by its clients, who those clients are, and what they worked on. And it's not just generic like, transportation issues or something. If a client had you work on AB 123 or SB 456, you actually list that. The lobbyist employer discloses the same thing. Obviously, it should match, right? We paid our in-house lobbyist and/or our contract lobbyist, like myself, this amount of money in the last quarter, and this is what they worked on our behalf. So the public, and that's on the Secretary of State website. It used to be all paper. Now it's, of course, filed electronically. But it's all available to the public and is publicly disclosable. And obviously, the goal is to allow the public to know what are lobbying interests, the special interests. How are they trying to influence state government decision making and legislation and regulations? So you can find that out today. And in most instances, whether it's testimony in committee or when you meet one-on-one with a legislator or their staff, I'm Chris McKaylee here on behalf of, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce in support or opposition to a bill. So most of what we do is, again, completely publicly disclosable. And that is in compliance, obviously, with an important state law. Um, there's about 3,200, just over 3,200 registered lobbyists in California, about 500 lobbying firms, and more than 3,500 lobbyist employers. And several $100 million every year gets disclosed as lobbying payments. Uh, and so about a third of those registered lobbyists, by the way, are what we call placement agents. Just over a decade ago, the legislature added a new type of lobbyist to file as a lobbyist. They're called placement agents, and they're folks who basically pitch financial deals to the state's retirement accounts, the boards, CalSTRS, the state teachers, and CalPERS, all the other public employee union members. And so they're regulated by lobbyists. So they have to disclose anything what they're paid. They are also limited, of course, by the gift rule. Oh, one other, I just mentioned the $10 gift rule. There's also a ban on contingency fees or success fees. That's also pretty unique. Like at the federal level, there's no such limitation. What does that mean? That means that you could be hired to lobby Congress, let's say on the one big beautiful bill and the tax provisions. Maybe you were hired by a corporation that if you extended a tax credit or created a new one, that they would pay you some percentage of that financial, tax benefit that they would get. At the state level, that's prohibited. So you can't have any form of success fee. In other words, if you're successful in passing or defeating a bill in California, you cannot be paid for succeeding. And so lobbyists in Sacramento, very few work on an hourly basis. Most work on a monthly fixed fee basis. So again, I remember years ago when my boss at the time, he was working on a piece of legislation that would have the state of California acquire some privately held forest land on the North Coast. It was a combination of federal and state monies. The lobbyists at the federal level helped secure a $400 million appropriation from the federal government to help acquire that land, and received a very handsome sum, having been able to be paid on a contingency fee basis. So he basically got a percentage payment based upon the appropriation he had secured, whereas my boss was paid a monthly fee for those lobbying services, and was complaining at the time that he, did not do as well as his federal counterpart. Anyways, So just a little bit of background, on the definition and who's disclosable, who is not, etc. Again, that procurement work, even though people are arguably lobbying, right, in the sense that they are contacting appointed officials in the executive branch of state government and they are lobbying them to purchase goods or services. They don't have to register as a lobbyist. There's no public disclosure of who their clients are, nor what they are paid for doing that work. So I think that's a reason to understand about procurement. There is no public disclosure. They're not regulated as lobbyists. I've always, so while there are legal definitions in the Political Reform Act, by the way, which is found in the California Government Code. You'll recall one of the 29 codes we have in the state. They define legally lobbyist, lobbying firm, lobbyist employer, and what we also call a lobbying coalition, but they're rarely used these days. I define four types of lobbyists. This is just me. What I call in-house. There are no formal titles or anything. I call in-house folks really those who work for a company primarily. So there's a lot of director, vice president of government affairs, state GR, federal GR, maybe local government relations, etc. I remember a gentleman who used to work for one of the tech companies, and he did state and federal tax lobbying, and then the company owned its first chip plant in Ireland, and he changed his card. It was director of international government affairs, and that's because he was lobbying the Irish government and helping secure uh, things of benefit for their facility there. The second I call are association lobbyists. There's literally an association for everything and everyone, from students to, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, the Labor Federation, the Chamber of Commerce, the wine grape growers. I always point out that even lobbyists have their own association. At the federal level, it used to be called ALL, American League of Lobbyists. Now it has a different name. I forget what it is. In California, the acronym is IGA, the Institute of Governmental Advocates. I don't think any of my colleagues call themselves, some will call themselves an advocate, but not governmental. But anyways, it's a loftier, fancy title. But so even lobbyists themselves have a trade association. Then there's those like myself called contract lobbyists. We called them that because they contract with one or more lobbyist employers. The fourth type of lobbyist, again, in my book, are the governmental lobbyists. What does that mean? Well, the people who work for local and state government have their own lobbyists, yes. Even though LA Metro, a public transportation agency, is a lobbyist employer and pays me, that's all disclosable. But they also have in-house lobbyists that handle state government affairs, for example. A lot of counties and cities, the bigger ones, of course, have them. So not just a contract lobbyist, they might be a part of an association. There's the League of California Cities. There's CSAC, the California State Association of Counties. Our second speaker about county government was is a staffer for CSAC, etc. And then in those 200 executive branch agencies, departments, they have lobbyists. Now their title is assistant secretary for legislation or deputy director for legislation, etc. But those are in effect the governor's lobbyists. In other words, they lobby state government, the legislature, in favor and opposition on legislation of interest to that department. So there's a deputy at Department of Motor Vehicles and Cal Fire and Cal EPA and Department of Insurance and all those. Now they don't have to register to lobby. So the idea being is, it's less likely that one part of government is going to, be corrupting of another. Now, again, those are my definitions. People often ask, sorry, about the typical background of at least state capitol advocates. As you can probably imagine, most have experience in the Capitol. There are some that don't, like Robin Ashley pointed out, that the way that the state chamber has done their hiring of lobbyists is that they've figured that they can, those people can make contacts and learn about the process, but they want subject matter experts and people with legal training. The vast majority of lobbyists are not with that background. The vast majority have worked, 5, 10, 20, or 30 years, some of them in the state capitol generally. Some work in the executive branch, of course, specific departments or agencies, maybe some specialized places, again, like the Public Utilities Commission, etc. And, why is that the typical background? Well, they acquire experience in policy areas. They establish a network of contacts. They understand and have worked in either the legislative process or the regulatory process. And then they take that experience, expertise, contacts, and generally move into the private sector. Um, so that's the typical background. Different lobbyists have different strengths and weaknesses for that matter. Some are, true subject matter expertise. They may have worked at a specific committee, for example, the judiciary or the health committee or education, and then they've gone to work for the teachers association or the hospital association, etc. Then there are those who probably rely more upon their relationships with either elected or appointed officials. So they are lobbying based more on the relationship and perhaps less so as to the, like the subject matter expertise. But I think most lobbyists are trying to bring that combination of, political and policy experience to help their clients maneuver and understand, of course, the process, whether it's legislative or regulatory. You want to know uh, the key players, the decision makers in those elected or appointed positions, and of course, their staff members. Uh, you want to have a good working knowledge of the policy area or areas that you're working in. In other words, really fully understanding the subject matter of a bill or a proposed regulation. And then, of course, understanding those regulatory rulemaking or legislative processes. Obviously, the nuances well beyond the, traditional how a bill becomes law, right? It gets introduced, is heard by a committee or two and on the floor, and then repeats the process and then on to the governor. Sure, everyone basically understands that, but obviously there's much more to the legislative process, and same too on the regulatory or rulemaking process. In California, uh, Lobbyist is the most common term, although many refer to lobbyist in the colloquial third house. Sometimes the Capitol Press Corps media are called the fourth estate, but lobbyist kind of third house. It's not necessarily a good thing from a public perception standpoint. Why do I say that? Because, of course, there are two houses of the legislature, the Senate and Assembly, or, the House and Senate at the federal level, et cetera. And calling lobbyists third house means to a lot of people that, they're so close to the legislative process that, they're part of the institution. I don't know that that's necessarily a beneficial term, at least from my perspective. I think as Rob and Ashley pointed out in the two, prior guest lectures, that uh, lobbyists play an important role providing information, background material, certainly detailed responses often to how a bill or a regulation can impact an industry or a subset of an industry. And so they spend a fair amount of time educating and advocating. I know sometimes, particularly folks who get into the lobbying profession, are often surprised how much educating and how much behind the scenes activity really goes on, whether it's coalition meetings or strategizing or developing advocacy pieces or other things. When we portray a lobbyist, it's usually, they're doing something with elected officials. They, might be portrayed as going to fancy events or fundraising things, etc. But a lot of that stuff is, just a small part of the job. There's so much that goes into before you can educate or advocate. You've got to learn a lot. You've got to put together, materials. You have to put together fact sheets. You have to, uh, write a support or opposition level letter, et cetera, et cetera, before you get into the actual advocacy. Some of the things I've jotted down, including researching and analyzing proposed legislation or regulatory proposals, certainly monitoring and reporting to clients about legislative developments, budgetary developments, rulemaking or regulatory developments, attending hearings of the legislative committees of regulatory bodies, working with coalitions or other interested parties on same or similar issues, et cetera, et cetera. Lobbying, although the definition comes from essentially, or the term is coined from essentially, advocates hanging out in, some have ascribed it to hotel lobbies and others to the lobbies of legislator offices and those areas that adjoin or before you enter into the chambers of the legislative bodies. Um, but it's sort of, set forth really in our U.S. Constitution, in that, and I don't mean First Amendment, right of free speech. I mean the right to petition government. And so really, I think, the notion of lobbying, whether it's paid or free lobbyists, whether it's local, state, federal levels, it's recognized in our, at least indirectly in our federal constitution. We know that governmental decisions, again, at the federal, state, and local levels, impact individuals, organizations, industry groups, et cetera, et cetera. I always like to say that everyone is a part of a special interest group. God, even in college, I was across the causeway at UC Davis as an undergraduate in student government, and we were heavily involved in the UC student association. And they advocated on issues of interest to students at the UC campuses, right? They're still around. There's a similar one for the CSUs and community colleges, etc. So literally everyone, whether you're again, whether you're a professional or you're a student, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's literally a lobbyist or lobbying organization uh, who are out there. I always note for folks that at the state level, I don't have federal or local information, but believe it or not, the largest employer of lobbyists at the state of California are actually local government. And that occurred primarily in the in the late 80s after the adoption of Prop 13, sorry, in the early 80s after Prop 13 was passed in 1978, which shifted a lot of school and local government financing to the state and away from locals. We also, at that time, certainly in California, we really got into a lot of regulatory activity affecting private sector businesses in particular. So the two largest by amount of money spent are local governments and then industries that are heavily regulated. Um, and we can all probably name them, whether they're oil industry, whether they're funeral directors, whether they're doctors and dentists and businesses that spray pesticides or do all these types of things. They're the ones who generally employ lobbyists. Again, those who are subject to state regulation or those who are largely dependent. That's why we have local governments that are, such large employers of lobbyists who are reliant upon the state's largesse, how dollars are being spent for, different services that are largely provided by local governments, cities, counties, those, 2,000 special districts and school districts and, all of those types of things. So, those are generally the largest employers. And again, we saw that certainly as California's economy has changed. I remember 25 years ago, just starting out, there was literally three tech companies, HP, AMD, and Intel, that had some sort of lobbying presence. Now you've got hundreds of tech and AI companies, plus you have a half a dozen tech CA, um, TechNet, Internet Association, Computing Technology Association, and several others. As these new industries you had when the state's voters legalized for medicinal and then later for adult use cannabis or marijuana, you had an entire lobbying industry sprout up. And now there are, not only individual companies, but a manufacturers association and, cannabis retailers association and cannabis growers association, et cetera. So as California's economy has changed, tech industry, biotech, uh, you know, most recently cannabis, et cetera, you've also seen growth in, those different industries and businesses and professions also, take on lobbyists, whether in-house, contract, et cetera, et cetera. So there are all sorts of, those types of things. Um, most lobbyists focus on the legislative branch of government, but there's a huge amount And as we get into the rulemaking process in course 3, I think you'll quickly see, how many regulations are out there, how many regulatory bodies we have in the state of California, and can understand why there's a whole cadre of lobbyists who are focused on the executive branch. Not just the governor's office, but again, a lot of these agencies and departments and boards and commissions. Um, and it's an area that a lot of my lobbying colleagues are far less familiar with. They may work regularly with legislators and understand the legislative process, but in the executive branch, we not only have uh, even more specialized subject matters, because these are the folks who really get down in the weeds of policies. They have to actually implement the statutes, often by adopting regulations or amending existing ones. Lobbying is much more, I would say, larger themes in the legislative process, in the rulemaking or regulatory lobbying space. It's far more specialized, it's very detailed. You're really focused on the regulatory language and how it's good or bad, why it affects some folks differently than others, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of lobbyists and lobbying organizations end up relying upon lawyers and or other uh, SMEs or SMEs, subject matter experts on the regulatory lobbying. But on just like you have elected officials and staff in the legislative branch, you have all appointed officials and staff in the executive branch side of things. So you have a whole different set of characters of other players. And of course, you have an entirely different process, the rulemaking process, the regulatory process by which executive branch laws are made by regulation versus the way that the legislative branch uses bills to become statutes and make laws that way. Um, I think some of those are some of the main things I wanted to cover. Again, I know that Rob and Ashley, tried to focus a little bit more on what the lobbyists do um, in picking a bill author and lobbying committees and floors and developing messages and all of those types of things. Um, and so I was staying a little bit more top level, if you will. Anyone have questions or want to talk about aspects of the lobbying process or being a lobbyist before we head into our other 2 weeks dealing with the California budget process?
Chris, I wonder if you would share some of the, I don't want to say better, but good shops in your opinion that are in town.
The good shops.
Just basically good lobbying firms that are doing
Oh my
good work.
gosh,
Yeah, there's so many.
I would probably leave folks out if I tried to name. I mean, a lot of the big firms are very good, but most lobbying firms are solo practitioners and even two or three or four. Um, I think it largely depends on what your what your needs are. I think, there are some firms who definitely specialize in particular areas. I've got colleagues in my building who one firm does primarily insurance, and then another one on a different floor does primarily local governments. Um, some do, um, I'll say, for lack of a better description, more democratic causes, and some who specialize more in Republican causes, if you will, maybe business versus labor or those who represent environmental groups or consumer groups, et cetera. And I think that there are, some wonderful, very strong people in all of those different issue areas. So it's hard to give, in my mind, it's hard to give a generic, this is a good firm or this isn't, because I frankly think that there are some that if I were a uh, insurance company, that I would maybe pick this lobbyist versus that lobbyist, or somebody who has, maybe I'm a lobbyist employer who needs money through the budget process. And so I'm going to probably, pick a firm or an individual who worked at Department of Finance or was a former budget committee staffer, or they do a lot of budget advocacy, you know. Um, Now, there are some lobbyists out there who are a good Jack or Jill of all trades. You sort of hire them because they've got, really good relationships, and they're not really subject matter experts, but they can, get your issue or your position before all the right people, and, so they have great access. But maybe there's other instances again where you need somebody who's got primarily some expertise in a certain subject area, or maybe they, it could be that they, uh, used to be a consultant at the Natural Resources Committee, or better yet, they were in the executive office at, say, Cal Recycle or Department of Water Resources, and now, you've got a regulatory issue at Cal Recycle, or you've, that it might make sense to get somebody who used to work there and, keeps in touch with their former colleagues and knows the ins and outs and the bowels of some of those rulemaking agencies, and how to maneuver there. So, I mean, I think that's really the best answer. I mean, there aren't, from my perspective, not that I know all 450 plus firms really well, but there's a strong cadre of folks out there. I mean, they all bring different strengths, whether it's relationships or particular expertise, or it's, you know, specific relationships with certain elected or appointed officials, et cetera, et cetera. And some lobbyist employers need something like that. Others may just have a generic, um, I did, when I first started lobbying at a firm outside of an association, I didn't know a damn thing about transportation. One of their clients was the Orange County Transportation Authority. And when I came in, they said, "This is one of your key clients." I worked for them for, I want to say, 7-ish years or so. It's been a long time. And then like 2 or 3 years, I didn't have anyone. And then I got picked up by LA Metro. I didn't have any particular expertise when I first started representing OCTA, but eventually developed, that area. So sometimes you want somebody who's, a good friend of mine who does a lot of transportation. 15 years ago, he was one of the consultants at Assembly Transportation Committee. I mean, he's been doing it all of his life. He's got very few peers in that area. But again, is that what you need as a lobbyist employer? I think that's a big factor. What is it that you're looking for? How about others? Any of the readings? Any quizzes? No? Okay. Um, well, again, as we wrap up lobbying, we're heading into the budget process. It seems that the budget process in California continues. When I first started lobbying 25 years ago, there was one budget bill. a handful of trailer bills, and that was it until the next year. Today, we seem to be doing budget related stuff every couple of months. So it's definitely an area to be familiar with, and I think it's the one area that most of my colleagues are least familiar with. Even though it is ultimately a bill, it definitely requires some unique knowledge and it has its own sort of sub processes. I sort of view the budget process as a sub part of legislative lobbying. I know many of my colleagues like to break it out. So some of them say that there are three areas of lobbying: legislative, regulatory, and budget. But from my perspective, budget is a subcategory of the legislative process. Anyways, with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and we will chat soon. Again, my lecture is set up. Look for a email, hopefully by the end of this week, for the guest lecture next week on budget process. Okay. Otherwise, feel free to reach out anytime with questions, concerns, or anything else. So I'll see you next week and the following.